All the crystal in the room caught the light and turned it into 1,000 tiny accusations. Cameras blinked in sequined hands. Waiters in black waited like trained shadows. A live band softened the edges of conversation into polite murmurs. Servers moved like practiced punctuation. Lila Hart stepped off the valet carpet into that glow and felt for a second the shape of every eye on her like weather, curious, anticipatory, a little hungry. She had rehearsed what she would say at the end of the evening. She had practiced standing still so that the camera would find her, because photographs, she had learned, made permanence out of a moment. She was 19, thin-limbed, her hair bleached to a whisper and cropped close, the high cheekbones and pale skin that marked her as a person with albinism, catching the lights differently than anyone else in the room. She moved with the quiet certainty of someone who had spent a lifetime negotiating attention. At school, at auditions, in crowded places where people thought polite stares were the same thing as seeing. Tonight she wore a simple black dress, sleeved to her wrists, a single silver chain at her throat. For Beacon Arts Collective, which she represented, this gala was a doorway, a promised gift from Harrington Philanthropies that would fund scholarships, studio space, outreach. She had written the acceptance speech with careful sentences. She had practiced the moment where she would step forward and speak for the collective of young artists she worked with. She had imagined the cameras recording something that mattered. They noticed her. Of course they noticed her. Cameras had a way of preferring unusual angles. Social feeds loved contrast. She saw him before he finished his laugh. Preston Harrington III, 22 if you counted the silver in his cuff, all lineage and entitlement tuned into a grin. He had the kind of smile used to win bets and erase apologies. He was already leaning on his parents' reputation like a man leaning on a column that someone else had carved. When he stepped forward, the room's attention didn't shift. It circled. People loved the start of a story. He lifted his glass the way some people lift a gauntlet, the wine catching the chandelier's light and turning crimson for a heartbeat. The movement was theatrical, practiced, a small act made to feel like an announcement. "Watch this," someone whispered. Phones came up. Preston's hand hovered above her shoulder like a punctuation mark. The wine tipped, a deliberate arc, and splashed across her dress and along her collarbone. For one immediate shocking second, the room held its breath. The glass flattened into a smear on silken skin. The light fragmented across the wet stain. Someone laughed, sharp and surprised. Lila's first instinct was the same animal instinct everyone has in those microseconds, to shrink, to cover, to disappear.
But she had learned a different muscle over the years, the muscle that held her spine like a column of sound. She lifted her chin. The red bloomed, an accusing petal, and the cameras painted it into 1,000 thumbnails. Preston laughed aloud. The sound found its audience and grew. Phones recorded. Parents leaned forward, delighted by the amateur spectacle their money had purchased. "Who is she?" someone asked after the laugh had curled away. Another voice, softer, added a name she had heard her whole life in tight, quick syllables, meant to make her less, not more. They called her the albino girl in feeds that later would truncate people into tags, a phrase that flattened a history into a headline. In the room, it was not a simple cruelty. It was an exercise in entitlement, a demonstration. The child of money could smear a stranger, and it would be a joke, not a crime. That was the lesson imprinted by many such evenings. Lila felt the wine cold on her skin, the wet making a map she had not asked to draw. The band shifted its tempo as if embarrassed for the moment. Someone murmured that she should go to the bathroom, as if an outlet and a towel could fix the intention behind a spill. She stepped forward toward the microphone stand that had been placed for her speech. The room expected perhaps a flustered exit, an awkward silence, a slip into concession. Instead, she moved with something like calm that had been trenched in when she was a child and had to teach grown people to be careful with words. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, voice steady enough to sound like policy, "thank you for this evening. I came here to speak for artists who do not have rooms full of money on their shoulders to make their names known." She let the sentence hang. A murmur threaded itself through the room, surprised at the decorum, amused by the fact that decorum could be wielded like an answer. Preston's laughter faltered because he had expected the spectacle to be a punchline, and instead found himself in a factual scene. He had expected embarrassment. Lila had given him consequence. "I will not accept a grant from the Harringtons tonight," she went on, each syllable placed like a brick. "Beacon Arts will not be affiliated with a donor who treats dignity as entertainment." The phrase landed like a gavel on polished marble. In the ripple of silks and tuxes, that tiny, precise refusal was an earthquake. Phones quickened again, this time with a different metric. The whispering that had been amusement folded into opinion. Some guests turned away from Preston and toward the stage, the social currency of watching being replaced by the shock of real stakes. Preston's face, which had not been built to hold consequences, controlled a flicker of panic that he tried to mask with a grin. His parents' hands tightened around their champagne flutes. "She can't mean that," someone said.
A delicate chorus of excuses began, because the Harringtons were entitled to the benefit of doubt their finances bought. Devon Shaw, Harrington's PR director, sitting a few tables over, watched the scene and did the thing PR directors were trained to do: calculate the optics in real time. Cameras found his reflective expression and moved on. He made a note in the margins of his mind to call Marisol. Marisol Trent, Harrington Industries' chief counsel, was already thinking of the legal ways to phrase an apology. Misunderstanding, she would say. Regrettable accident. She had a card the size of small defenses. She kept it warm in her wallet. The gala's live feeds stuttered, and social clips cropped the moment into a dozen different narratives. Some framed Lila as a righteous icon, others as an overreaching child making a scene. Preston's circle curated outrage with the practiced efficiency of people who lived in image economies. A brusque apology from Preston, a private message to Beacon offering to fund the scholarships anyway, an offer of a hush. The camera never showed the hush. Lila walked off the stage the way someone walks off the edge of a plan, carefully, as if she had measured the stride. There were people to meet and to shield. She had rehearsed for humiliation, but not for the after, not for how it unspooled into policy and phone calls. A few faces in the crowd found their way to her with apologies that tasted like afterthoughts. Some offered towels. An older woman reached out a hand. "You handled that wonderfully," she whispered, and Lila smiled because it felt like a currency that didn't sting. The moment had gone viral within the hour. Clips looped on social apps with comments that turned the incident into morality theater. The caption slogans were a map of the room's divide: privilege exposed versus snowflake reaction. Someone with a verified badge posted Preston's version, claiming he meant no harm. The Harringtons released a statement that night: "Regrettable incident. We are in contact with the parties involved." They framed it as an accident. Their lawyers circulated the phrase "unintended but unfortunate."
It was simple and dangerous, and for some reason, exactly the kind of small strategic rupture she loved. So when Devon's associate asked if Beacon would like to issue a statement, Lila said without hesitation, "We will not accept the Harrington grant." The phrase had teeth. It was an action, not a plea, a refusal to allow charity to be both a balm and a brand. The Beacon board, which had been in the ballroom's green room watching the feed, convened within minutes, and after a quick, tense vote and a flurry of messages, agreed to stand with Lila. Their statement was crisp and public. Beacon Arts Collective declines the Harrington Philanthropies donation, pending a full reconciliation of the philanthropic organization's commitment to equitable treatment and dignity. It wasn't a legal victory. It wasn't a criminal charge. It was a symbolic cut. But symbolism, in a media-saturated world, can move markets and people's perceptions. In the hours after the gala, Harrington Philanthropies' brand began to tick under stress. Donors who had once been anonymous in their loyalty called their boards. A few foundation partners asked for meetings. The Harringtons felt the first ripple of reputational anxiety like a cold draft. That evening, after the gala lights dimmed and the bottles were tallied, Lila took a long walk home through the city to let the cold air settle the heat in her chest. She kept her phone in her pocket and let the city unspool around her. A late diner with its neon flicker, a taxi's muffled kiss, the way the sky over the river held city light like a bruise. The world was noisy and insistent, but the things she had chosen were small and deliberate, and they fit the shape of someone who wanted to be more than a story. At exactly 11:30, the phone buzzed with an encrypted message she did not recognize. The screen displayed only a simple line: "I've been keeping records. Meet me tomorrow at the Rosewood Cafe, 11 a.m. E." Her heart did not race the way a frightened body's heart does. It steadied with recognition. She knew the initial, careful edges of that handwriting. Eleanor Reed, Ellie, to those who had known her for decades inside Harrington houses and corridors, had been more than a housekeeper. She had been an attendant of secrets, small invoices tucked behind curtains, overheard arguments in rooms where decisions were made without witnesses, receipts that read like soft footnotes to theft. Ellie had worked for the Harrington family for 37 years and left the estate last year under terms whispered about in kitchen corridors. Lila's mother had kept a steadiness that made people lean on her without noticing the labor of leaning. Ellie was Lila's mother. They had known, in quiet ways, about the Harrington world. Lila would sometimes be carried to the estate as a child for a summer brunch, where crystal bowls sat heavy with fruit. Ellie had worked the countertops, and later told Lila the stories of staff rooms and money moved in the margins. Ellie had, over years, kept notebooks about who signed what and when. She had a little ledger, Lila remembered, folded and tucked like a relic. Lila's knees tingled with a small electrical fear and a deeper readiness. She texted back, "I'll be there. Bring whatever you have." The Rosewood Cafe was the kind of place where the baristas could pretend to be novelists. Around a chipped table in the back, Ellie unwrapped thick manila envelopes like a midwife delivering evidence. She was smaller than Lila remembered, hair silver and pulled back into a bun, its white strands a steadiness against her clear brown eyes. She met Lila with a hand that had been steady at bread and stoves and the machine of maintaining other people's households. Her hands bore the particular pale calluses of constant work. Inside the envelopes, staff logs, 2 decades of receipts, calloused pages of a ledger where payments were redirected into shell accounts, a folder of photographs, dated and annotated in Ellie's hand, a thumb drive with audio files of recorded conversations, the kind Eleanor swore she only had to prove the truth to herself. The pages smelled of paper and time. "This is everything you asked me to bring," Ellie said. Her voice was low and firm. "I kept them because someone had to. I was tired of seeing the young ones used as tokens, watching how they treated people like furniture. It started with small things, a nurse's check cut, a staff contract quietly ending, and it kept growing." Lila let her eyes slide over the documents with a surgical patience she had learned from years of reading contracts as part of Beacon's negotiations. Dates and signatures, smudged bank stamps, memo lines, faint initials in different hands. In the margins, she found phrases that did not match corporate language: for discretion, housing allowance to cover incidentals, a transfer to account 47C, Harrington discretionary. There were photographs of off-books remodeling at properties owned by the Harringtons, receipts for art pieces bought at astronomical prices and labeled as restoration fees. There was a small folded note with a shorthand scribble: MR, personal disbursement, PM, payment to influencer. Ellie had kept the margins of a family ledger because someone needed to be the human counterweight to their gloss. "It isn't just money," Eleanor said, tapping a page with a veinlet finger. "There are letters here where they wrote off people. There are invoices paid under names of organizations that don't exist. They spread the money around like confetti, and it makes them look like saints, but the confetti is made of other people's trust."
Between sips of coffee that cooled on the saucer, Lila listened to audio snippets Ellie had labeled with the dates, a voice with a Harrington cadence referring to managing inconveniences, a recorded call between a procurement arm and an obscured vendor, the soft, bureaucratic language of concealment. Ellie had a note where she described overhearing a conversation in which a Harrington board member instructed a staffer to make the narrative stop. When Lila asked how she had stored everything, Ellie tapped the inside of her apron pocket. "I kept copies. I kept them because I thought one day I'd need to remind myself that truth is also a thing you can own," she said. "Sometimes it's the little things you keep that undo the big things." Lila felt the weight of that sentence like something she had been missing. Truth as property. She imagined folders as a cache, a quiet arsenal, not of vengeance but of accountability. Her mind made a ledger, verifying these, establishing chain of custody, making sure timestamps were validated. She could already see the media cycles and the ways the Harrington machine would try to muddy water. She thought of the gala earlier that night and the red stain on her dress, and how easily an image could be made to mean anything. They left the cafe with duplicates of the envelopes, scanned to a secure server Beacon used for legal work, physical copies hidden in safe deposit boxes, and a plan fragile enough to bend but not break. Marisol would need to look at the chain of custody. Devon would want to build a release strategy that could not be drowned out by Harrington preemptive statements. Sandra Hull, an investigative journalist Lila had met once at a panel, had already agreed to read a preliminary brief if Lila offered it to her in person. "Don't put anything on social until we've verified," Ellie said sharply. "They'll discredit anything that looks like a rush. If they can call it a lie, they will." "Exactly," Lila said. She had learned to treat haste like an infection. "We do not leak, we document, we preserve the originals." For days that followed, Beacon became a workshop of verification.
The team, a small group of volunteers and one senior director who believed in the cause Henry Barton had built the nonprofit on, sat in rooms with whiteboards and legal pads and an anxious respect for procedure. Marisol Trent, a woman with a legal tone practiced into soothing, ran through lists that made the documents atomic. Paper trails, bank confirmations, signatures cross-checked against scanned IDs, timestamps on digital files, forensic hashing to create fingerprints for digital artifacts so they could later be verified as untampered originals. "We need to make sure the chain is airtight," Marisol said at one meeting, thumb running the rim of a mug. "If we can't prove a clean transfer from that thumb drive into a secure server, the Harrington team will call it tampering."
They will question the provenance, and they will see doubt. "How do you prove it's the original?" Lila asked. "You get multiple witnesses to the handover," Marisol said. "You photograph and video the physical copies with time-stamped cameras. You log them into a notary-style custody list. You never let that drive out of guarded control. And you work with a third-party forensic lab to create a digital hash. If the files are altered, even on the smallest bit, the hash will not match." Lila watched the legal team convert everything into procedure. The technical language was reframed into a script that made sense to her. Treat the evidence like an heirloom you don't want to lose. Keep a ledger of every hand that touches it, and then let the world see the ledger. It was slow and structural in a way she liked. Meanwhile, across the glass towers where the Harrington family held court, the mood had shifted from trivial to tactical. Gregory Harrington, the patriarch, called a board meeting the next morning. Melissa Harrington, his wife, who wore benevolence like an accessory, watched early network coverage and bristled at the sight of Lila's refusal. Their counsel, Marisol's counterpart at Harrington Legal, drafted a short statement about regret and misunderstanding. Devin Shaw drafted 3-tier responses, an immediate soft apology, a strategic reframing of Preston's conduct as youthful misjudgment, and a back channel to potential donors to shore up support. They had decades of experience buying time and narratives. Preston pored over the trending clips with the reckless attention of someone whose life had taught him to measure everything by likes. He could see, for the first time, the difference between a joke and a story that might not be controlled so easily. His father called him into a study heavy with oak and oil paintings to talk about reputational management and making amends, and, under the table, to begin the mechanics of a defense. Not all of Harrington's responses were polished. In a smaller thread on an underground forum, someone who claimed to be close to the family began sketching out a counter-narrative. It started subtle, an insinuation that Lila had staged the incident for attention, a suggestion that Beacon was leveraging victimhood for fundraising. The whisper turned to chatter. Lila's inbox filled with polite and ugly messages alike. Some were supportive, some were thinly veiled threats. The Harrington machine had resources it could wield, lawyers, PR, money, but it also had something that scared a certain kind of citizen: connections. Against that, Beacon moved methodically. They logged everything. They secured the physical documents in a safe deposit box and uploaded copies to an encrypted server with multiple witnesses present. Sandra Hall came in to read the first briefing. She took her time, elbows on the table, insisting the team do the work that would survive public scrutiny. "If you want this to land," she told Lila, "we have to make it incontrovertible. We can't rely on outrage. We have to rely on proof." Days blurred into stacks of paperwork, notarized signatures, printed emails, scanned checks. The narrative Lila and Ali built was granular and human, a portrait of institutional opacity made by accounting and habit. There were endorsements that paid off old debts, housing allowances that shifted on paper to shell entities, invoices that had been marked restoration for projects that never occurred. The scale was not extravagant as in a Hollywood heist. It was banal, routine misdirection, the type of small theft that aggregates into something monstrous. Beacon prepared a schedule, a limited release to trusted press who had agreed to hold the story until verification, a briefing to regulatory agencies given under confidentiality protections, and a private meeting with Harrington's counsel that served as a courtesy and a warning. The last was a necessary theater of civility. They would give Harrington a chance to respond in a way that looked reasonable. That window was a procedural courtesy more than a negotiation. The Harrington lawyers received the first letter with a perfunctory politeness. Such letters were common in their inboxes. They passed it to their team, who asked for time and then, privately, called a strategic advisor's evil twin, a technology firm that specialized in reputation defense and digital countermeasures. This firm had the capacity to seed alternative narratives, identify leaks, and counsel on how to most effectively discredit an accuser. What Beacon did not yet know was how far that firm would go. Within a week of the cafe meeting, a low-grade smear unfurled like a test balloon.
A community forum posted a clip purportedly from a private party where Lila could be seen, the clip grainy and cropped, in an exchange with a younger man in which she appeared to speak in a way that, if taken without context, could be framed as manipulative. The feed caption read, "Stage setup, she started it." The clip circulated among Harrington allies with the faint thrill of vindication. They clipped it into appetizers for opinion sites. The move was small, a simple seed, but the strategy was clear: flood the feeds with conflicting footage, create enough static that the public's attention would fracture. Beacon's team watched the first smear with controlled alarm. They traced the clip to a private forum, to an account with proxy servers. Devon's PR strategy shifted from defensive to surgical: find the source, vet the footage, and prepare an answer that could not be shouted down. Sandra dug into the metadata. She saw what any careful reporter knows to look for: timestamps, compression signatures, file paths. A vigilant archivist is the closest thing to a truthsayer in a media war. "Don't react publicly yet," Sandra advised.
If it's doctored, calling it out before we can prove it gives them the upper hand to say you're just making noise. And yet the smear was only the first flicker. Harrington's next move, unseen by Beacon, was more deliberate. In a back room where decisions were made without witness, the firm Harrington hired set about crafting a narrative not merely to discredit Lila, but to transform her into the origin of the controversy. They proposed a campaign of counter-visuals, small visual slips and injected context that would make even the most sympathetic viewer question the totality of Beacon's case. Their deliverable included curated leaks about Ellie's past, a paper trail that could be spun into a headline about personal grievances and long-held vendettas, rather than an ethical accounting. Ellie noticed the first of these moves before Lila did. She opened a message thread with a screenshot of a short forum post that used sloppy, cruel language about her, a character assassination built on innuendo. The post suggested that she had been fired for misconduct, a claim that was technically true in the sense that she had been forced to leave after some internal dispute years before, but the post reframed it as moral failing rather than labor conflict. In the thread, trolls piled shoulder to shoulder, and the tone hardened. "It's the usual playbook," Ellie said over the phone in the evening, voice steady. "They'll try to make us the story, make your mother the motive, make her anger personal. They think if they can make people see my past as revenge, they can make them doubt what's on those pages. But paper doesn't lie, Lila. Paper only requires a hand to open it." Lila listened to the noise as she sat at her kitchen table with a stack of legal pads and a mug gone cold. She thought of the gala and the tiny arc of a pour that had become a national conversation for a night. She thought of the edges of her mother's hands and the way those hands had kept a ledger. She thought of how the Harrington machine will build a story to drown a fact. She slept badly. When she checked her phone in the morning, there was a short clip waiting in a private message, footage of her earlier at the gala, but framed in a way that suggested she had turned the moment into a performance. The clip had been edited to slow and then accelerate certain gestures, a cut that subtly altered timing. Lila watched it twice and felt a coldness in her gut. It was not just the clip. It was the fact that someone had the time and the skill to make a version of truth that could be believed by millions. Beacon's lockbox contained the originals. The encrypted server had the backups. Marisol had compiled a legal memo that listed email threats, receipts, and invoices. Sandra had a reporter's notebook with corroborating testimony from former employees who were willing to speak on the record about policy inconsistencies.
They had not yet released a single document to the press, though they had teasers, a small, credible whisper to a reporter who liked cause over clout. That gave them a foothold. But Harrington would not go easy. When institutions were rich, they could pay delay and distraction as long as it took for the public's memory to move on to the next outrage. That was their most powerful defense. On a rainy Thursday, the first serious counterattack hit. Lila's bank account, personal and small, was frozen for review. It was a bureaucratic hemorrhage. The holding notice came from a regional manager at a bank unrelated to Harrington, but connected through a tangled web of shared accounts and corporate influence. It was a technicality, the notice said, but it would take days to untangle. Someone had flagged her account in an information cascade of doubt. Beacon had set funds aside for operations. The amount was modest, enough for studio rentals and printing costs. Suddenly, cards declined at a supply store. A letter from a landlord arrived asking for proof of stable funds. It was the first move toward isolating her in the small practical ways that make reputations bleed into daily survival. When the clip that framed Lila as the architect of the scene aired on a gossip network, the anchor voice was flat and professional and neutral in tone. A controversy is brewing after a viral clip shows a young activist confronting a donor at a high-profile charity gala, the voice said. The clip cut to Preston, looking abashed and repentant, offering a contrite statement. "I meant no disrespect," He read off a phone screen passed to him by his father. It was the performance of repentance polished to remove consequence. Lila's phone filled with reactions. Supporters worried, critics gnashed. Beacon fielded calls from donors who wanted to see facts. The founder of Beacon, Henry, who had seen the arc of nonprofits before, sat across from Lila in the Beacon offices with his hands folded like someone who'd carried disappointment and not been undone by it. "We expected pressure," he said. "What matters now is our muscle memory. Document, document, document. Do not allow them to make your moral courage look like a temper." And then, late that night, a new twist. A short clip circulated with less subtlety than the others. It was allegedly from a private party where Lila could be seen speaking sharply to a younger man. Jacket sleeves, gestures, a line taken out and looped until it sounded like a threat. The composition of frames suggested a construction. Lila recognized the angles used in the edit, the jump cut between two takes, the impossible continuity of a movement that, stitched together, broke physics just enough to feel like a different reality. The smear had moved from rumor to fabricated evidence. The Beacon team gathered in a room with a whiteboard where they'd pinned a chronology.
Devon paced with a legal pad of micro notes. Marisol scrolled through files, feeling the obsessive clarity of counsel. Ellie sat there at the edge of a chair, hands folded. "They're making a film for the feeds," Devon said, not unkindly. "They're going to try to make your response at the gala look performative, staged. They'll try to show motive where none exists." "Why us?" a volunteer asked, anger breaking through the procedural calm. "Because you hit a soft spot," Marisol said. "You cut them where they are visible." "Because you refused the gift," Henry added. "Public refusal is dangerous to the brand. People like to buy their reputations back. When someone refuses that purchase, the seller gets ugly." They collected the clips and, where possible, saved copies, noting timestamps and download routes. Sandra chimed in about the patterns she had seen in false footage, small mismatches in lighting, reflections that did not line up, audio that carried different ambient noise than the visual, and metadata with traces of popular editing software that should not be present in a raw phone clip. She had flagged these as suspicious. "Let forensic labs look at everything and give us an answer," she said. "We can't win by shouting. We win by showing the hook of the lie, the thumbprint of manipulation." Lila felt the net tightening in ways she had never anticipated when she refused the gift on a stage. It wasn't just the online chatter or the sting of being photographed while soaked in wine. It was the sense that wealthy people could buy time, and that time could be used to erase meanings. She slept in fits. In the quiet hours, she would run the agenda of the next day in her head, call the newsrooms, meet with Marisol, keep the donors calm, ensure the chain of custody for Ellie's documents remained absolute. She thought of the gala's chandelier and the way wine had turned into a scar for the cameras. She thought of Ellie in the kitchen, fingers like punctuation marks on an envelope. On the morning Lila thought they had corralled the documents enough to present them to an investigative journalist in a controlled way, a new development landed in her inbox, an unverified video that had been posted under an anonymous account and then picked up by an influencer with a large following. The video showed a montage of Lila stepping on stage, followed by a second clip where she speaks in a softer voice to an unseen person. The sequencing implied orchestration. The file's metadata was stripped. The file name was meaningless. Someone in the comments had already sown doubt. Staged. Paid actress. Another voice said, "If she was so brave, why run to the press?" Marisol looked up at the screen and said quietly, "They're using the playbook I was afraid they'd use. Find a clip, isolate it, seed doubts, then rumor will do the rest." Lila felt a coldness press at the hollow of her throat, as if someone had pressed a palm there. For the first time since the wine had warmed her skin, she felt like retreat was an option. She also felt, larger and steadier, the reason she had refused the gift, that dignity was not for sale, that vulnerable people were worth protecting. She thought of the other young artists Beacon served, the ones who would not be able to shield their lives from a smear in the same way she could attempt to. "Do we go public with Ellie now?" she asked. Marisol inhaled carefully. "If we go public with the documents before we've secured the forensic and legal scaffolding, they will call us reckless. If we wait, they will try to bury them. We are making choices in a machine designed to reward delay." "Then we outmaneuver the delay," Devon said. "We create an undeniable package. We get third-party verification. We coordinate the release so every major outlet receives it at once. We bring in a forensic expert who can speak plainly and show the banners of manipulation. And we prepare for the smear," Sandra added. "We line up witnesses, we collect bank records, we do the boring work so the boring work can win the day." They moved through the protocols like people who had been training for something that didn't have a name. Cameras in a lab, letters to lawyers, notarized lists of who touched an envelope.
Lila signed a consent form to have her account reviewed by an independent investigator who could confirm the freeze on her account had been an anomaly and not a reflection on her integrity. She had interviews with former Harrington employees who confirmed parts of Ellie's ledger, a maintenance invoice here, a misdirected payment there. Piece by piece, the quiet architecture of Harrington's internal practices revealed itself. Still, the smear engine churned. The anonymous...
But it's not just money. If we bend now, what are we teaching the kids who come to our after-school rooms? That dignity can be rented. The more Beacon held, the louder Harrington's countermeasures roared. Packages arrived at Lila's mailbox, anonymous letters with photocopied screenshots of Ellie's supposed past indiscretions, a smear site recycled into print, anonymous voicemail threats that whispered of exposure. Volunteers who had offered testimony suddenly received calls from private investigators asking about their lives. A maintenance worker who had once cleaned a Harrington property was approached in a parking lot and warned about getting involved. Even a landlord, who had been flexible in better times, received an intimidating letter from a firm that claimed to assist high-net-worth clients with assets preservation, and then requested immediate proof of Lila's income. Lila felt the pressure in small, corrosive ways. A delivery held at the post office, an invitation rescinded. It was not only a campaign against credibility, it was a campaign to make ordinary life difficult. Then came the vandalism. One cold morning, Beacon's office glass was shattered with a rock left on the hardwood floor. Across the lobby, someone had spray-painted a crudely lettered accusation on a storage door, staged. It was an act both childish and deliberate, a physical extension of the smear into the real world. Volunteers who had spent nights stapling flyers to community boards now debated whether to install cameras, to hire security, to close their public-facing classes. For a young woman who had learned to keep calm in public, the accumulation of small wounds began to add up. Lila found herself crying once in the empty meeting room, not from the humiliation, but from the fatigue of constant vigilance. Ellie called that evening, voice like soft glass, and reminded her daughter of the ledger in the safe deposit box and the notarized copies in the encrypted server. "Rest when you can," she said. "We did what we needed to do. The world will make noise. That is its job." Her steadiness was a small island. By then, the smear campaign's center of gravity had shifted. It was no longer merely social media. It had leaked into administrative maneuvers. A municipal arts council postponed a meeting about a future partnership, citing concerns about pending questions. 2 small corporate donors who supported local after-school programs requested audited financials. The friction started to erode momentum for the very people Beacon served. Lila watched those ripples like someone watching a watercolor spread. It hurt to see the work of years slowed by rumor. Then a curious thing happened. An investigative fragment that should have been poisonous instead became the opening for proof. A clip that appeared on an influencer's account and later was rebroadcast by a trending show had an odd reflection. In the doctored footage, a tiny catch. For a half second when Lila moved her head, the glass on a chandelier caught the room and reflected a pattern that did not exist in the real ballroom. Someone with an archivist's eye, a former museum conservator turned volunteer at Beacon, who had once cataloged frames for exhibits, flagged the discrepancy to Sandra Hole. It read like a mistake. The forger had cut footage from a different event, perhaps even a different venue, and spliced it so slickly most viewers would never notice. But once you saw the wrong reflection, the rest of the piece showed the strain of being constructed. Sandra followed that thread and sent the clip to a trusted forensics contact she had used on old investigations, Dr. Hannah Ruiz, a digital forensics specialist who taught at a nearby university and ran an independent lab. Hannah returned emails late, the way people with real evidence often do, meticulously and with questions that mattered. She asked for the highest quality copy available, not the re-uploaded compressed version, but the original file if Beacon had it. Beacon did not yet. They had preserved the originals of Ellie's documents and audio, but the doctored video had been seeded through multiple private servers that stripped names and tags. "Send me the best version you have," Hannah wrote. "I'll look for editing artifacts. There are ways to see the join when a clip is stitched." Hannah worked in small, precise flourishes. She returned with a list that read like forensic poetry: frames duplicated, an inconsistent frame rate between sequences, a color profile change that implied the footage had passed through an editing suite, a shadow that bent the wrong way for the room's light source. Most importantly, she found traces of a common consumer editing suite in the file's re-encoded layer, a fingerprint left by software defaults that many amateur and professional editors use when they render a timeline. That in itself wasn't definitive, software is widespread, but it meant the piece had been actively modified, not simply captured. Then Hannah found the reflection. In a single frame, a chandelier's filigree reflected an architectural detail that belonged to a different hall, one with a vaulted ceiling and a broad clerestory window. It was a mismatch that could not occur naturally in the Harrington ballroom. Someone had composited in a gleam from elsewhere. Hannah explained it in plain language to Lila and the team the way she always explained things to the public. Think of a copy of a painting that someone altered by gluing in a sliver from another picture. Up close, the brushwork looks off. On a screen, slight differences in lighting and shadow are the brushwork. When you find those mismatched reflections and frame duplications, you have a map of the cheat. Her test results also showed a Kelly metadata trail. Even when files pass through many hands, certain hidden markers remain: timestamps, encoding signatures, render presets. Hannah's lab could extract the remnants of a timestamp that suggested the clip had been edited and exported at a time that coincided with a private upload to a server registered to Harrington Interest's affiliate company, a lesser-known shell that traded in reputational management. The lab traced the server route through a chain of proxies, many of which belonged to firms with plausible deniability. It was not a smoking gun. Metadata can be faked, and proxies are meant to conceal. But it was the start of a breadcrumb trail. Armed with Hannah's analysis, Beacon's legal team felt they had the foothold they needed to go public in a controlled way. The plan they hatched was surgical: bring the best forensic evidence to a tight group of high-integrity newsrooms and regulatory investigators simultaneously, present the physical documents Ellie had preserved, and demonstrate in front of cameras, in plain terms, how the fake clip had been constructed. The goal was not to win an argument in an op-ed. It was to show the anatomy of a lie in the presence of witnesses in a way that would be difficult to unravel through fuzzy counterclaims. For the Harrington side, the week before the scheduled reveal was one of panic disguised as strategy. Advisors told Gregory and Melissa to shore up donor confidence. They recommended public benevolence gestures. Devon Shaw tried to thread the needle on public statements, but even he could see the tilt. Preston, now widely chastened, received private counsel and a string of publicists' notes about how a contrite statement from him could heal reputations, a performance in which remorse must look genuine and not rehearsed. Behind closed doors, the Harrington legal team argued whether to seek an injunction to stop Beacon from releasing documents. If they could have bought the calendar, they would have. Beacon's release date arrived at a small downtown hall, chosen not for pomp but for its practical acoustics and the availability of a stage. They had invited 3 national outlets, a consortium of watchdog journalists, and a representative from the Federal Corporate Accountability Office, an independent regulatory agency that investigated misuse of charitable funds and corporate philanthropy. The room was half full with reporters and half full with the public, volunteers, artists from Beacon's programs, neighbors, and a handful of Harrington donors curious to see what would be called the true story. Ellie sat beside Lila, hands folded and steady. Ellie wore a simple knit cardigan that had seen better decades, but it suited her like an honest label. Henry opened with a short statement about the importance of civic institutions and the need for factual clarity. Marisol read the legal framework, what would be presented, why it had been verified, and how chain of custody had been preserved.
Hannah stood to the side with a small laptop and a projector. She would be the one to explain how the forger had made the clip. "We are not here to indulge spectacle," Marisol said into the mic. "We are here to present structured, verified information that shows wrongdoing and to offer it to bodies that can take steps. We understand the process of inquiry has to be respected. We are asking you to look at what we have found and decide accordingly." Reporters clicked pens. Cameras adjusted white balance. A clip rolled of the original Gallapore, the unedited footage Beacon had, a clean file from the Galla's official photographer. The camera then cut to the doctored clip side by side. Hannah began. "What I will show is not a theory," she said. "It is a forensic observation anyone with a reasonable toolset could replicate." She explained simply, "Every digital file carries marks of its life, like fingerprints. We compute a hash, a mathematical fingerprint of the file the Galla camera recorded, and compare it to the circulating clip. They don't match. That tells us nothing was simply captured and distributed. It tells us the circulating clip was created separately, then re-encoded." The room humped. She projected a pause frame that zoomed into the tiny chandelier reflection. "Here is the giveaway," she said. "In this enlarged frame you can see a series of architectural lines that cannot exist in the same field of view as the Harrington ballroom. The angle is wrong. The shadow direction is wrong. Those reflections were composited. That is, pieces of footage from a different place were layered onto the Galla footage." Hannah's slide showed a simple illustrated diagram, an original Galla frame, an overlay of the composite element, an arrow showing where the join occurred. She next explained frame duplication. When someone trims and stitches, the rendering process introduces duplicate frames or drop frames where motion continuity breaks. Those stutters can be detected by algorithms that look for non-natural variants in motion vectors. We ran that test and found anomalies at the exact points of the claimed threatening gestures. A reporter in the front row, who had covered digital manipulation before, asked about audio. Hannah nodded toward a sound waveform on the screen. "We compared ambient noise levels. The doctored clip's background ambient noise is inconsistent across cuts. That suggests audio tracks were spliced from other sources. It is not necessarily malicious in every case. Sometimes it's sloppy editing. But when combined with visual composites and a server route tied to an affiliate company, you have a coordinated effort to alter context."
Marisol then introduced the physical ledger Ellie had kept. The camera moved slowly over pages with tiny handwriting, dates, and annotated invoices.
The production team had reserved time with a notary who had photographed the notarized envelope openings and logged witnesses for the transfer to secure possession earlier in the month. The chain of custody list was projected, names and times visible. The ledger revealed patterns, recurring transfers to shell entities, invoices that referenced restoration for properties that later showed no records of work, a string of payments to consulting entities tied to a board member's family. It was bureaucratic, slow evidence, the kind that judges love because it is boring and thus hard to twist into conspiratorial glamour. Ellie spoke then, not in a theatrical voice, but in one that carried the weight of years of attention. "I kept these because someone had to," she said. "I didn't set out to be a hero. I only wanted to make sure that when people sat at long tables and moved money around, there was a paper trail that looked like truth, and not whoever is loudest." Her testimony was plain and exacting. She named dates, actions, small details that only an insider could have known. A contractor who was paid twice, a vendor who was never on site, a notation that a key board member's initials appeared beside a questionable disbursement. As the press conference closed, reporters asked pointed questions. Several investigative reporters stood and said they would take the file to their legal desks. One asked the Federal Corporate Accountability Office representative whether an inquiry would be opened. The representative, carefully neutral, said, "Where there is credible evidence of misdirection of funds or false representation in corporate philanthropy, the office will review and determine whether our investigative authority is warranted." Within 48 hours of the press conference, two things happened. First, a major national outlet published an in-depth piece that corroborated many of Beacon's financial claims through independent sources. Second, the Federal Corporate Accountability Office announced it had opened a preliminary inquiry and had issued subpoenas to several Harrington-affiliated entities. The public reaction was swift. Donors who had been on the fence began to express discomfort publicly. One foundation returned a Harrington donation and issued a statement about their commitment to transparency. The tide began to turn. When investigators obtained permission to search certain Harrington servers, it became clear that Beacon's evidence had not been a fluke. Forensic copies of email chains, procurement records, and unusual vendor contracts were pulled. In a small darkened room lined with boxes, investigators found internal memos that referenced discretionary disbursements and a set of pass-through invoices that matched names in Ellie's ledger. An accounting trail that had once been spread like confetti was being reassembled into a map. The legal case took time. Nothing happens overnight in white-collar investigations.
But within the week, the story shifted from rumor to inquiry. Warrants were issued for records. Specialist auditors were contracted to parse months of transfers. In the public eye, the Harrington machine began to wobble. Harrington's response became defensive and then reactive. Gregory Harrington issued a brief public statement expressing regret at the gala incident and promising to cooperate with inquiries, while simultaneously enacting a legal offensive, a lawsuit against Beacon alleging defamation. The legal move felt like a muscle memory strategy, take the opponent to court to shift the narrative. But the more Harrington pushed legally, the more documents the regulators demanded, and the more reporters dug into the transactions. Preston, under pressure and appearing visibly strained in a televised interview, apologized again and promised community service. His apology was measured, and he pledged to volunteer with local youth programs. The cameras took to him with the same intensity they had used to capture the wine splash. Public opinion is fickle, but a man of his resources can pay to be forgiven more easily than an entire community of the marginalized. Meanwhile, the Harrington PR firm's darker maneuvers started to unravel. The same affiliate server Hannah had traced to the doctored clip pointed investigators to communications that suggested a targeted campaign to create counterfoils, planted narratives, curated leaks, and engagement of influencers to seed doubt. Emails showed contracts with a technology firm that specialized in reputation stabilization, with budget lines for content seeding. In that firm's invoices, a line item caught an investigator's eye: contextualization services, billed to a shell company that had once tied back to a board member's family office. Faced with subpoenas and public attention, some of the Harringtons' inner circle began to break ranks. One mid-level executive, evidently frightened at the legal exposure, reached out to regulators and offered cooperation in exchange for immunity. Their testimony tied certain transactions to directives from a small group of senior executives who had direct access to discretionary funds. With corroboration from internal emails, auditors were able to reclassify certain philanthropic disbursements as misappropriated corporate funds, a red flag for financial regulators. On a rainy morning that felt like an exhale, federal investigators executed warrants at a Harrington-affiliated office, seizing workstations and physical ledgers. Photographers captured the scene: black SUVs, investigators with warrants, boxes loaded on a dolly. For the system's watchdogs, it was a milestone. Not a conviction, not yet, just a lawful seizure to preserve evidence. Later that week, the press tweeted the images, and the public's attention swung by degrees. The political calculus shifted in the halls where donations are tallied.
Several corporate partners paused their public-facing initiatives with Harrington Philanthropies pending the outcome of the investigations. A board meeting of Harrington Industries that had been scheduled as routine became explosive. Board members faced questions on fiduciary duty and the optics of philanthropic influence. Tensions escalated. Some board members tendered their resignations. In another private meeting, Melissa Harrington argued to salvage the charitable arm, to continue doing good despite mistakes. It felt to onlookers like trying to extinguish wildfire by rearranging tokens. Preston's parents eventually called a press conference of their own, a carefully scripted choreography meant to demonstrate accountability. But for many, the spectacle of legal warrants and document trails had already reframed the story. People no longer saw only the gallows moment, they saw an institutional pattern. Beacon's small victory, the bringing of hard evidence into a public verifiable forum, proved catalytic. The narrative shifted from whether Lila had staged humiliation to whether Harrington's philanthropic machine had been used to conceal and normalize questionable fiscal practices. Public empathy moved in a slow arc toward the people who had been on the receiving end of Harrington's generosity whenever it served the family's public image. Yet, the victory was not clean. There were legal counters. Harrington's lawsuit in civil court continued, as did a barrage of motions and filings. Harrington's lawyers argued procedural matters and questioned the chain of custody of certain documents, demanding depositions and audits. Beacon spent weeks in depositions, answering questions about document possession and asking hard ones in return. Legal battles are staircases with many steps. Progress is incremental. For Lila, the long, small victories and the bruises were equal parts fatigue and vindication. The community's response, protesters outside Harrington properties, petitions calling for greater philanthropic transparency, and growing demands for regulatory reform, gave Beacon a platform to propose structural remedies. They drafted proposals for an independent transparency registry for large philanthropic gifts, stronger auditing requirements, and a whistleblower protection fund that would offer counsel and financial support to staff who expose wrongdoing in philanthropic contexts. That last idea, the fund, came directly from Ellie. "We need to make it easier for people to do the right thing," she told Lila in a conversation that would later be quoted in a dozen articles. "If you keep a ledger, and the price of that ledger is your reputation, that is not a defense, that is a tax on honesty." Beacon refined the idea into a formal plan, an independent trust that would provide emergency support, legal assistance, and counseling for whistleblowers in nonprofit and philanthropic settings. They proposed it as the Eleanor Reed Whistleblower Fund, a name that honored her role and served as a permanent reminder that institutional love can't substitute for institutional integrity. As the regulatory investigations continued, Harrington's philanthropic arm underwent an internal audit ordered by a new temporary board that had the cooling air of people called in to prevent worse damage. The audit found warping practices, unrecorded disbursements, insufficient oversight on certain grants, and conflicts of interest where family members or allied entities benefited. When the audit report was compiled, the knowledge that projects had to be unwound became real. Several programs were paused and reevaluated. And then, in the legal rhythm that those of legal careers know well, indictments arrived. Not everyone was indicted. The law proceeds on evidence and probable cause. But a senior finance officer at Harrington Philanthropies and one external consultant from the reputation firm were charged with counts that included filing false records and conspiracy to conceal the true purpose of disbursements. Arrests were carried out in the late afternoon light, and the images of handcuffs and folding chairs in conference rooms, the same kinds of chairs where donor events once happened, appeared in evening news segments. The charges were the start of a formal process. They meant court dates, discovery, and a legal ledger that could go on for months. For Lila and Beacon, they represented the first judicial recognition that some wrongdoing had been alleged with enough evidence to warrant criminal process. The Harrington family publicly denounced the charges as selective enforcement and vowed to defend the institutions the way families tend to defend legacies. Social opinion remained split in pockets, but for many in the city, the arc of accountability had started to feel real. Through it all, Lila insisted on one thing: this was not personal revenge. When a reporter asked whether she felt satisfied at the arrests, she chose a measured answer. "This is not about seeing people fall," she said. "It is about preventing systems from taking what they will in the name of charity. There are people who do good at Harrington who are not part of this. This is about shifting the structures so that generosity can't be used as a curtain." With the legal dust settling into long procedural days, Beacon turned toward the structural work it had promised. They launched the Eleanor Reed Whistleblower Fund with a modest initial endowment, gathered from local foundations, individuals, and a small anonymous donor who had been moved by Ellie's steadiness. The fund's charter specified emergency grants to cover legal expenses and temporary living costs, an advisory board of former compliance officers, and a public hotline maintained with confidentiality protections. More importantly, Beacon proposed an independent registry where philanthropic gifts above a certain amount would be logged and audited, with accessible public summaries that would not invade donor privacy, but would track the allocation of funds against stated goals. The proposal sparked conversations in city halls and at other nonprofits. In the months that followed, Beacon found resources to expand its counseling services, support artists directly affected by the funding freeze, and create workshops about media literacy, teaching young artists how to prepare for the media cycles that could follow public work. The artists who once watched Lila with curiosity now spoke at community meetings as peer mentors. The rhythm of the nonprofit shifted from defensive to generative. The final public moment that marked the arc began to form in the same ballroom where Lila had been humiliated. Beacon decided to host a community gala, not to replicate the old hierarchy, but to flip it, to celebrate transparency and recognize whistleblowers with dignity. They reached out to a manufacturer of chandeliers and a catering team that measured its margins by community engagement. The ballroom, once a stage for entitlement, would become a stage for accountability. On the night of the gala, cameras found different faces. Former employees who had once been invisible stood at the entrance as ushers. Volunteers framed a small exhibit in the corner with pages from Ellie's ledger, not as trophies, but as artifacts of civic labor. In a quiet ceremony, Beacon presented the inaugural Eleanor Reed Award for Courage and Accountability to Ellie herself. She received it with a flat surprise, and then with the recognition that things can change, slowly and not without cost. Lila's speech that evening was not long. She spoke with a voice that had once been rehearsed for acceptance speeches, but now had been tempered by months of long procedural days. "When someone pours something on you to make a joke," she said, "they imagine that they are erasing you with a gesture. But dignity does not come from what others do or do not do to you. Dignity is shown by how we treat one another afterward." Ellie kept a ledger because she believed truth was property we could own. We turned that ledger into a public good. She paused and looked at her mother, who sat in the second row with hands folded and eyes bright. "Tonight is not about punishment," she continued. "It's about responsibility. It's about building structures so other people don't have to choose between a job and their conscience. It's about turning pain into protection." The applause at the end was honest. It did not erase nights of bad sleep or lawsuits. It simply acknowledged that the arc had shifted. Preston, who had kept a low profile during the investigations, sent a note that evening to the Beacon email address, offering to volunteer and to make amends in practical ways.
Some critics sniffed at the gesture as performative. Others saw it as the complicated work of a person who had been handed power and was now learning what it meant to unlearn entitlement. As the event wound down, reporters asked for a final comment from Ellie. She gave a small, clear answer about why she had kept the documents. Because someone has to remember. The phrase was simple and exact. In the months after, legal proceedings continued in federal and civil courts. Some executives negotiated plea agreements that required restitution and cooperation. Others fought cases that would move through discovery and trial. The processes were slow and necessary. Beacon had not promised instant justice and had made that clear from the beginning. What Beacon and its community achieved, though, was a change in practice. Several foundation partners adopted more rigorous audit requirements. At least 2 philanthropic organizations publicly announced transparent registries and independent audits as part of new governance practice. The Eleanor Reed Fund began to receive calls from whistleblowers who needed temporary support to tell truths that mattered. The Harrington philanthropic arm restructured. The family retained influence in some circles, but the sheen of unquestioned benevolence had dulled. There were resignations, a reconstituted board, and new compliance protocols. For some families and institutions, the lesson was jarring. Public generosity cannot substitute for internal integrity. Years later, Beacon's small after-school studio had an expansion funded by a coalition of local donors and reformed philanthropic channels. Lila continued to sketch and write grants, and to teach an occasional class on art as civic practice. Ellie, whose quiet ledger had been the pivot point, retired from the rhythms that had shaped her life, and took up a small role as an advisor to the Whistleblower Fund, where she would answer calls from frightened people and explain, in a voice that had the smell of kitchens and ledgers, how to keep a record. The final public moment came in a looping echo of the original scene. Beacon organized an awards night, not a gala for the wealthy, but a community dinner, held in the same hall where a glass of wine had once become a stain on a dress. Now the chandelier caught the light and turned it into something else,
banners celebrating community arts programs, plaques that recognize the collaboration of auditors and civic groups, and a small table with a ledger on display as a reminder of the cost of courage. As guests moved toward the exit, Lila paused in the doorway. She let the light catch her pale hair and the line of her shoulders. Cameras still found an angle if they wanted, but she did not think about that.